Will you pray with me? Through my words, O God, and in our hearts, finish our story. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. I love baptisms, but the one problem is this is where I usually stand. So I'll be moving around a lot more, I think. I remember a story from a friend of mine that I always think of whenever we hear this story we heard from Acts this morning. In Christian parlance, we refer to this as the story of the Ascension. That is, when Jesus bodily ascended into heaven 40 days after the resurrection. And I remember talking with a friend of mine who was kind of Christian adjacent. She had been raised vaguely Quaker and so knew some of the bigger stories, but was interested in the story of Jesus, but not necessarily willing to commit to it. And I remember her asking me at one point, "So, where are Jesus's bones?" And I had to think for a minute. I was in college at the time, and I thought, okay. I mean, Jesus was raised from the dead, so they're definitely not in the tomb. That was the whole point, that the tomb was empty. But then what happened after that? And I remembered this story, that after Jesus had hung around with his disciples for 40 days, he was taken bodily into heaven. And so I tried to kind of tell that story as best I could and say, so I guess Jesus' bones, Jesus' body is in heaven with God. My friend was not satisfied by this explanation whatsoever. Her response was something like, well, okay, but what if you don't believe that? Then where are Jesus' bones? And I thought, I guess if you don't believe in any of that, then they're, somewhere around Jerusalem, in a pit somewhere, I guess. We are really good at, building shrines and temples and hanging on to holy objects. And you'd think if we had Jesus's bones, we would have, built a church there or something. And it struck me that this is one of those really weird stories that we are nevertheless kind of called upon to believe. And it's not quite a story like in Alice in Wonderland, where the Red Queen says, "I've often believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." We're not called to believe it just because it's impossible. But we are called to wrestle with this story. And again, it is less about the literal presence of Jesus' body than it is about what this means to us. I forget who it was, but someone calculated that if Jesus ascended into heaven beyond the clouds 2,000 years ago, then by now, if he began to move at the speed of light after leaving Earth's atmosphere, he's by now just getting to the edge of our galaxy. So there's that. Which brought into my mind earlier this morning the idea of sort of supergalactic Jesus. Which sounds like a great comic book that I'd love to read. But anyway, it was funnier in my head at 8 o'clock in the morning. But the point is that if we take this at face value, it's kind of ridiculous that Jesus kind of went flying around for a while. But instead, what we need to understand is not that Jesus went up above the clouds, but that Jesus' body, this body that was crucified, this body that was buried in the tomb, and this body that was raised from the dead with its scars still present, this body that loved, this body that wept, this body that sweated and ate and did all of the things that it means to be human, that this body is in the presence of God. And if that is true, then we too are in the presence of God. The whole point of the incarnation, that is, God becoming human in Jesus, is to remind us that our lives, our physical reality is holy, is something that cannot be separated from our spiritual identity. So for Jesus to be in the presence of God means that we too, or our humanity also, is in God's presence. We tend to think that God became human to remind us that there is no place that we can go where we can be apart from God. But we forget that the reverse is also true. That God became human so that there is no place where God is that we too cannot go. That Jesus, in being ascended into heaven, brings our very humanity into the presence of God. That we ourselves, that all that we are, is in God's presence. What a gift. What a beautiful truth. And more than that, one of the ways that we talk about Jesus' presence in heaven is we talk about Jesus as interceding for us, as praying for us, which is kind of an odd idea to think of Jesus in heaven praying. But perhaps it is better to understand it as Jesus simply bringing ourselves, our lives, our concerns before God. That Jesus is whispering your name into his Father's ear with love, reminding you and reminding God of God's deep and abiding love for each one of us. And more than that, we hear at the end of our gospel reading, which is from this, we're going to get to you, Autumn, I promise. I promise, sweetheart. Don't worry. I haven't forgotten you. She's great. We have these words from Jesus, which are his kind of prayer for his disciples. And it is the last thing he says in John's gospel before he goes into the whole story of his death and his resurrection. He is praying for his disciples, and he is essentially saying to God and to them, this is it. I have told them everything. I have given them everything, God, that you gave me to give. And they know that I did that. They know that what I've said comes from you. They know that every teaching, every healing, every miracle, every moment is a gift from you. And they have that within them. And they have gotten all of it. And now, he concludes, protect them in your name so that they may be one, as you and I are one. Jesus' prayer, offered forever in the very presence of God for all of us, is that we may know our fundamental oneness, that we may acknowledge that we as human beings are in fact just as intimately connected as Jesus and God, that we share in one spiritual reality of our identity, that we are one. And what would it change? What would it do if we were to live into that? How would our world be different if we knew deep down in our bones, and if it were just plainly true that we are all one? What would that do? How could one nation go to war against another if we are all one? How could any person look at another group of people and say that you are less than if we knew that we are fundamentally one? How could any moment of prejudice or oppression or discrimination exist if we are all the same, if we are all one body? how could any of what we see be true? And more than that, how could we abide the fact that there are people in this world without enough to eat, without enough to drink, without a safe place to live, without the care that they need to survive? How could we possibly abide that if we are truly and fundamentally one body? If we are one? That is the dream. That is the prayer offered forever before God. That is what our humanity in Jesus is doing in heaven, is bringing that reality together. And that is what we are doing today. We will in a moment bring Autumn into this family family of the baptized, reminding her that she is deeply and perfectly loved, and bringing her into this fundamental unity of humanity. Bringing her into a community that tells that story, that refuses to accept anything that keeps us separated from one another, that refuses to allow the structures which seek to separate us, which seek to oppress us, which seek to divide us, refuses to allow those structures to stand. We will baptize her into this great work, into this great prayer, into this great moment in the life of God, in the life of the church. Because the ascension, Jesus' presence in the very heart of God, may be the end of the story of the resurrection, but it is only the beginning of ours. Amen.